In this video, I want to look at effective revision strategies, but also give some rationale to why they work. The best place to start is to look at how we learn and, unfortunately, how we forget. This is a basic diagram of how our memory works. There's three distinct parts to this diagram that just need a little bit of explanation. Now, this is a really simplistic way of looking at this, but it hopefully helps to outline how these revision strategies are going to help you to learn and help you to remember. So our first part is the environment, and really what we're concentrating on here is our attention. We can only attend to a small amount of things at one time. So we need to make sure that we direct our attention to the things that we want to learn. So with that in mind, we need to consider the environment in which we're learning in, which we'll talk about briefly in a moment. The second part is our working memory. Our working memory is where we process information that we hear, that we see, and we can only process a really small amount of information, what we consider to be a few small pieces of information. If we try and take in too much information, we basically get overload, and our working memory can't cope with too many things. So if I was to give you a number to remember with a number of digits in it, and there was only 3 or 4 digits, it would be quite easy for you to retain. But if I gave you one with maybe 15 digits in it, it'd be really hard for you to remember because your working memory can't hold on to that much information. The third part is our long-term memory, and ultimately we want things to go to our long-term memory so they're stored there for us to be able to use at a later date. The only way to commit things to our from our working memory to our long-term memory is by using them regularly. You'll know that things that you can remember, what we would say off the top of our head, because you've thought about them multiple times, you've maybe spoken about them, read about them, used them, and therefore it's things that you know, and things that you can remember because you've committed them to your long-term memory. But that's happened over a process of lots of usages of that information rather than being told something and you remember it forever, because that unfortunately isn't the reality. The reality is that we actually forget things. We either have things that never enter our long-term memory, something that you've been told, and at the time you think, oh yeah, I know that and I understand it, but it doesn't take long for it to be just lost, and we just forget it. It falls out of our working memory and we never remember it. We also have things that we've committed to our long-term memory, but unfortunately over time, if we don't think about them or use them, then gradually we forget. And I'm sure we can all think of things that we learned in parts of our lives where at the time we really knew all about it, but because we never used it, that actually it just fades over time. And that's a consideration that we need to take into account for our schooling, because obviously we learn things that we are going to have to retrieve at a later date in assessments, using them in tasks, and specifically in formal exams. So that's a really basic model of the sort of three parts of learning. So in terms of our attention and getting that information into the working memory, and hopefully over time committing that information in our working memory to our long-term memory and holding on to it. So how are we going to make sure that we maximise the opportunities for learning? So unfortunately, we have forgetting. And this graph represents the forgetting curve, and it shows how much information we're likely to retain over time. And the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve has been around for nearly a century, and in terms of its usage, it's still used today. And it shows that over time, we gradually forget information. So the moment we're told it, we know it and we retain it. But within around 20 minutes, we may have forgotten up to nearly 60% of that information is now being retained. So we've forgotten around 40%. And you can see as time progresses over the hours and days following, that we're going to have forgotten the majority of that information unless we do something about it. And what I mean by doing something about it is to revisit it, to think about it, to see it, to use it. And that will help us to stop forgetting. And the best way to think about this is things that in your life that you do know lots about and that you can remember. There's a likelihood that you have used or thought about those things many times, therefore they've been committed and strengthened within your long-term memory.